And so welcome everyone to this afternoon session on some supervision and interdisciplinary working. We're delighted to welcome Douglas with us today to present and lead this afternoon session. So this session has been organised by the Interdisciplinary Research Network, which is part of a week-long symposium. The Interdisciplinary Research Network has been supported by the Sterling Fund, and we are a group that is run through Microsoft Teams. If you'd like to get involved more with the group, then drop us an email and we'll get you added into that team as well. So this session will be recorded, and the recording will be made available afterwards through our Teams service as well. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Douglas and he can get started on today.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. Perhaps while I introduce myself, the host could enable participant screen sharing so I can share my slides. That would be great. Thank you. So welcome, everyone. I'm Douglas Halliday. I am based at Durham University. Great. So I can now share my introductory slide. So I'm based at Durham University. I'm a professor of physics in the Department of Physics, and I've worked in a number of interdisciplinary research programs for doctoral candidates for quite a number of years now. So what I'm going to do today is give you a presentation in two parts. So the first part will be a literature overview, just to give you some sense of how you might locate your own views and your own understanding within the literature framework. And the second part is a presentation of a study that I did at Durham a few years ago with a colleague, Margaret Kiley. Those of you that research doctoral education itself may well have heard of Margaret. She's a very well-known authority in this area and is based at the Australian National University. However, before we start, I have a little task for you. So I've got a little Menti presentation up and running. So if you could pick a device of your choice, go to menti.com, M-E-N-T-I.com, and enter the 8-digit codes there. What I'd like you to do is enter 3 words that you think captures interdisciplinary research. And we will see what comes up on the screen. So over to you. I'm hoping that when you type, things will appear on my screen and you can see it. So let's see if that happens. Excellent. This is exactly what I want. Keep going. Ooh, that's interesting. Time-consuming, innovative, bridging the gap, unique, wide in vision, exciting, collaborative, creativity, challenging. Ooh, challenging is getting bigger. I think that means that more people must be typing challenging in. Exciting. Well, I'm pleased to see you attributing those adjectives. Okay, that's really interesting. I mean, just quickly, I will circulate a link to this afterwards so you can download it. I mean, to be honest, I think I would completely endorse everything that you've put on the screen, and maybe we'll come back to that. So just to give me a sense, here's a simple poll. So enter what you think is the most appropriate response in the poll, and we'll see where we end up. Okay. Okay. Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, you know, I was expecting some people to say yes, but you know, the fact that, you know, just under half of you have said you're not quite sure, that's quite interesting, isn't it? Because, you know, for me, moving into interdisciplinary spaces is a journey, and sometimes you don't actually realize the journey has started until you've gone a certain distance and you look back and you think, oh, you know, I'm in a different sort of academic environment. How has that happened? Is it by accident or is it premeditated? So, well, thank you for those responses, everyone. I'm going to go back to my slides now. So let me just very quickly go back to my slides and move on. So what I'd like to do is to start with some definitions. And just while I remember, in the chat, I'm going to put a bit.ly link. So if you click on this link, that should enable you to capture and download a copy of my slides as PDF files. So you're more than welcome to do that. I've set an end date, this link at the end of the month, so they're available. And I will send them to the organisers afterwards. But sometimes people might want to have them as I'm going through, and it saves you having to sort of capture lots of detail. So we've got lots of definitions of how we can embrace bringing together different disciplines in the research context. And you've got some widely accepted literature definitions here, multidisciplinary, where you bring together different disciplines in perhaps not necessarily a very connected way. Interdisciplinarity is where you begin to have an interaction between the different disciplines, communication of ideas, integration or organization of concepts, and so on. And, you know, as a sort of long-standing academic, I would say that's probably the space I most inhabit when thinking about working across disciplines. Then you've got pluridisciplinary, which is not really used a great deal in the literature, and then transdisciplinary, where we establish a common system for a set of disciplines. And right at the very end, I might say something more when I talk about a new initiative, our Global Challenge Centre, Doctoral Centre at Durham, which is aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. So we've got an idea of thinking about how these different disciplines interact. So here is quite an interesting illustration. So you've got the apple, which is the monodiscipline. Then you can sort of chop the apple up and put it into a rather lovely fruit salad. But of course, within the salad, it's still very much recognizable as an apple. And, you know, you might be the kind of person that likes to pick out individual bits of you know, fruit from a fruit salad and go for the, you know, the strawberries or the raspberries first or whatever. So, but it's still recognizable. And then we move into a smoothie, you know, where a core constituency would be the apples. So it still has a lot of characteristics of the apple. But then you get into the sort of multi-fruit ice cream where, you know, the apple is much less distinct. It's part of a much more harmonious blending of ingredients together to produce something entirely new with entirely different set of characteristics, but, you know, with elements that are nevertheless recognizable. So that, you know, can be a helpful visualization of what's going on. So if we look at this comparison between disciplinary and interdisciplinary curricula in graduate education, and the references you'll find if you've got the slides right at the very end. But, you know, you've got the traditional curriculum where we have, you know, faculty with specialized training, where students are provided with, you know, a depth of knowledge and specified disciplinary fields of inquiry. You know, you've got the research where you engage in the research activity, which is effectively designed to extend the knowledge in a particular area and so on. And then you can see the sort of different dimensions here, which I won't say a great deal about, but the administration and the institution. And, you know, these structures are quite important because many of our universities are organized along very traditional disciplinary boundaries. You know, at Durham, we have a Department of Physics, a Department of Chemistry, biology, you know, so we are a very traditional sort of fairly full subject spread university with faculties of science, social science, arts and humanities, and a faculty of business. You know, so that is quite old traditional classification. In fact, some of that goes back to medieval times. Whereas in other universities, you might see departments that have very different titles and very different structures. So, that begins to say something about an organization, doesn't it? If they've got a department of, biomedical engineering, or a department of palliative care, or a department of, road transport, some random examples, that begins to suggest that they are thinking about other areas as sort of disciplinary groupings, which is quite interesting. And, so in this interdisciplinary column, so, thinking about most of you, this is where you will locate yourself. Students and faculty engage in collaborative activities related to problems or topic that cut across disciplinary boundaries. So the random example that fired in my brain of road transport is one example. I'm going to be talking about energy later on in my sort of case study. So that's another way of thinking about disciplines and interdisciplinarity. So if we look at the literature and sort of begin to think about some of the common themes or issues that come out of the literature, then we can begin to sort of tease out what some of these are. And, I should say that if you would like to sort of ask a question as I'm going along, please, stick up your hand, or, turn on your microphone and shout at me. And, I'm more than happy to field questions and discussions as we go along, but, equally well at the end, whatever works for you. So, the sort of the typical critique or criticism or question that you almost invariably get from people is, how far can interdisciplinary research go, where you end up with someone who is a sort of, well, in colloquial language, a jack of all trades, someone who knows lots about many different things, but really isn't an expert in anything, because the primary requisite for a doctoral degree, be it a PhD or any other kind of doctorate, is that you have to develop new knowledge in a particular field. Well, if you can't necessarily articulate what the field is, does that still enable you to do original research in that area, which has to be recognized? Peer recognition is a very important part of research, both in terms of publication conferences, but also in terms of the examination of the thesis itself. So how do we make sure that we don't compromise the integrity of existing disciplines? So that's issue one. Issue two suggests or highlights some challenges to the doctorate. So, the idea here is, how is interdisciplinary understanding or multidisciplinary understanding related to sort of single disciplines or monodisciplines? And, in the words of Hyman here, centrifugal forces that cause critically important constituent disciplines to opt out. So does interdisciplinary work grow out of existing disciplines? So that's a particular issue or question. And maybe that has some resonance with your own experience. You would have started your academic career presumably studying an undergraduate bachelor, and then maybe onto a master's, and then onto a doctorate. At what point did you identify your field of study? At what point did you say to yourself, I'm going to be an expert in, sort of next generation solar energy materials, which is one of the areas I research? Interesting question. So moving on, issue three. The challenge for higher education is to provide training that enables students to realize the benefits of disciplinary affiliation and develop interdisciplinary competencies. So that's beginning to suggest that if you want to move into an interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary space, you need to be able to develop new competencies. Well, what are those? And I'll touch on that later on in my presentation when we come to think about some examples from the energy PhD program at Durham. And there are always challenges. How do you engage with, staff and faculty? I mean, the perennial question for postgraduates is who pays for the photocopying? So if you're an interdisciplinary student, do you go to physics, who've always got lots of money, and ask them, or do you go to anthropology and hope that no one notices you're using the entire departmental photocopying allowance. And, that might sound a bit glib, but, some of these issues can be quite significant, or can become quite significant barriers over time. So that then raises the question, what does an interdisciplinary community look like? Are we who are gathered on this call today a reasonable example of an interdisciplinary community? Question, discuss. So, I mean, you very correctly identified in the word cloud at the site, I thought actually a very positive and optimistic tone. So clearly there are benefits in engaging in interdisciplinary research. And you can see here that, the first sort of sequence of benefits that we have identified. Candidates together from disparate fields work together and help one another from different perspectives. That's really important. Increasingly the world is becoming much more complex. And I will say more at the end about, sustainable development goals. But, for example, if you want to engage in a research project that is aimed at one of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, I don't know, for example, poverty or disease or energy, you cannot come at something as deeply embedded in society and as complex as that without having different perspectives, different languages to really help you understand that. So I think that's, a really interesting benefit. Working in teams is a bit like the workplace. You might often find yourself, working with people from different backgrounds. How do you establish a rapport? What is the language of communication that you use? How do you ensure that you have a common and shared understanding of what this issue is? And how do you know that the other people have the same view as you? That's all about language, interaction, communication. And that raises an interesting question, which I'll touch on later. What is the language of interdisciplinarity? I'm a physicist, amongst other things. We inhabit multiple spaces often, but, a physicist talks in a particular way, using a particular type of language. I wouldn't use a very intensive physics vocabulary to discuss what I'm doing with you, because that's not appropriate. So what is the language of interdisciplinarity? And this question about ever narrower specialization. So this is about breadth versus depth. And this is a really interesting issue that I think, if I may say briefly as an aside, has come to the fore as part of thinking about COVID and how one responds to the restrictions imposed by the pandemic. Because in compensating and adjusting, you might have to rescope your PhD project. So does that mean that you sort of go for slightly more breadth in your thesis rather than more depth? So those are interesting questions that, I think reveal a sort of complexity that is sometimes quite difficult to get a handle on. And yes, so this last one is really interesting, and I'll make some comments later about the characteristics of good or what we believe to be the characteristics of good interdisciplinary researchers. And that's really important because, you as the candidates, you are the ones that have to bring it together. You have to navigate the different spaces. So I, supervise one of my PhD students is co-supervised with a member of staff in anthropology, and she's from India. She has to navigate those different spaces. And that can be quite a challenge sometimes, I think, for candidates. So the second sort of group of benefits and challenges are about, greater responsibility for, staying on track and focus. Interdisciplinarity is an amazing playground. There's lots of places you can go and explore and sniff around and look at and so on. But, fundamentally, if you're on a doctoral program, you have to get a PhD, and, that requires you to maintain a sort of focus, so there is that responsibility that sits on the candidates. You might have to develop your own community. As I was saying earlier, what does an interdisciplinary community look like? You might find, you feel you don't necessarily belong Is that a problem? If so, how might you deal with it? How might you create your own community? Career paths can be quite difficult to identify, particularly in academia. I mean, I think, the issue has moved on, in recent years, but certainly, 5-10 years ago, you would never really get any traction in an academic career if you had sort of spread yourself out in interdisciplinary work. I think there's much more recognition of the importance of that now. And indeed, many research councils are now actively encouraging and promoting interdisciplinary working. And, the ever-present problem of publishing, I mean, that applies in single disciplines as well, but particularly in interdisciplinarity, are those journals that will readily accept this fascinating interdisciplinary publication, are they regarded with the same esteem and impact as the highest impact journals in individual fields? And I think at the moment the answer is probably not. So that's a particular challenge. And then sort of moving on, thinking a little bit about research culture, I mean, the PRES, the Postgraduate Research Experience Survey in the UK, has told us for, well, almost since it started in, I don't know when it started, over a decade ago, I think, has told us that, research culture or the intellectual climate is an area where, postgraduate researchers would like to see greater efficacy and greater impact. And, that then leads to questions about, well, how do you characterize an interdisciplinary research culture or an interdisciplinary research environment? What are the rules of the game? Some are explicit, but some, are picked up implicitly. So things like, how do you present a really good and dynamic and effective seminar in an interdisciplinary environment, taking account of the fact that you have a range of people with different disciplines in the audience? That then goes back to the language, doesn't it? How do you communicate? All sorts of things about journal clubs, authoring, co-authoring, and getting yourself recognized as an established researcher, which incidentally I think is entirely possible before you complete your PhD. But I think that's a really interesting challenge. So those are some of the things that really impact on sort of the wider environment. And then we sort of move on and think about disciplinary differences. The science, I used to jokingly say to people I was a card-carrying positivist. I just looked for facts or information through experiments that, I believe to be true. And, that underpins the sort of scientific method. But, in social sciences and humanities, there's a wealth of research methods. Indeed, the notion of research method itself is sometimes contested, so there are very different sort of world views about how new knowledge is generated, new knowledge is constructed, and how to bring those paradigms together, or as I say there, bridge the gap. That sometimes can be one of the, the really big challenges that we face. So, the question that we've thought about is, what is the difference between an interdisciplinary environment versus interdisciplinary research? Because I think the reality is that what I've provided, or what we've provided for our candidates in Durham, is an interdisciplinary research environment, and that actually the number of research projects that are really interdisciplinary research projects are quite modest. And that is a challenge. If you want to see interdisciplinary research grow and develop, we need to think, or you need to think about, how do you promote interdisciplinary research? So that's a sort of question which I'll touch on when we come to the sort of case study at Durham. So pulling all that together from the literature, we've got this sort of suggestion of criteria for a successful interdisciplinary student. So does this sort of reflect who you see yourself as? And interestingly, some of these words are quite similar or sort of aligned with some of the phrases that you put into the word cloud at the start. Risk taker, curious, embrace other ideas, come from a very varied professional background, had a range of experiences before, ending up where you are, focusing on a problem. The problem itself can keep pulling you back to a particular space, which might sit between disciplines. People who are prepared to have a go, have an additional commitment. And the last one is quite interesting. I have to be honest and say there wasn't a great deal of evidence from the literature for, being high on emotional intelligence, but that was something that sort of emerged from our sort of review of literature and our interactions with some of our PhD students at Durham. So, I just leave that as a, so I don't know whether any of you identify with any of these characteristics. So what I'd like to do now is to sort of move on and think about the study that we did at Durham, looking at PhD students in our Energy Centre for Doctoral Training. So I'm going to let you read this slide while I have a little sip of good old-fashioned Northumbrian tap water. So. We wanted to find out what were the benefits for the candidates in this sort of training program. So the backstory to all of this was that in 2009, we got a 5-year grant from EPSRC to set up a doctoral training centre in energy. And it was specifically multidisciplinary. And you can see at the bottom of every slide here, I've got a sort of Durham Energy Institute, Science and Society. Well, Science and Society is our sort of logo or motto. That's been updated to Energy, Science and Society. But effectively, at Durham, our sort of worldview or our flavour of energy is that it is really important to think about the interface between energy technology and society. So my area of research is into photovoltaic materials, solar panels. So I can spend, millions of pounds and many years developing this fantastic, highly efficient solar panel. But, if it looks horrid and people are not prepared to put it on the roof of their house, or if it's too expensive to manufacture at a competitive cost against, carbon-based fossil fuels, for example, then, that technology isn't going to get much progress. So you need to think about the alignment between the technology and the society. So at Durham, we have research projects where the geographers and anthropologists will quite happily sit alongside the engineers and the physicists and talk about different dimensions of research. So that was the background. And we've kept the Centre for Doctoral Training going. It's effectively a training program now. We don't offer scholarships or stipends, but we recruit PhD candidates who are studying at Durham into the program if they want to join it. And we provide this sort of multidisciplinary training environment with workshops, seminars, field trips, a 2-week mini team project. And the idea is that these PhD candidates are all doing a PhD project that is linked to energy in some way, but they come from physics, chemistry, maths, biosciences, geography, anthropology, business, law, and so on. So they're all coming with their own sort of disciplinary perspective, but we put them in an environment where they interact together. So that's sort of, roughly what our Energy Centre for Doctoral Training is. But, just before we sort of rush into that, what about a single, well, actually this might apply to an interdisciplinary PhD. There's a lot expected. So if you were to answer the question, what is a PhD? I would say, well, one of the places you can look is in the United Kingdom or UK Quality Code for Higher Education, which is on the QAA website. So this effectively describes the UK benchmark for doctoral awards. So if you take all the words out of the qualification descriptor and remove all the sort of, the adverbs and the link words and the words that don't, really add a great deal, this is a word cloud. And when you look at this, there's a tremendous amount in there that, candidates are expected to do. And, I have highlighted original new knowledge and forefront slightly larger than the other alternatives, because I think for many candidates, that's an area of concern that they have. How do I know my work is sufficiently original? How do I know that it's new and that someone else isn't beavering away in some unknown university on some unknown continent on exactly the same problem? Well, I have to say my experience of 30 years of supervising PhDs is that never happens. How do you know that something is at the forefront of knowledge? Those are challenges in single discipline, but equally so in interdisciplinary research. So the other sort of background information is about structures. So, here's a sort of, I don't know what you call it, organogram or something of Durham University. So we've got the Faculty of Science, the Faculty of Social Sciences, the Faculty of Arts and Humanities. We've got these different academic departments. We've got an Arts and Humanities doctoral partnership. We've got Social Science doctoral partnership. We've got some doctoral training centres in engineering and physics. And, our energy CDT spans all of these. So you need to think about, well, where are the touch points? Where do candidates connect? Where does their identity come from? How do we help them inhabit these different spaces in a way that, adds value to the experience rather than just unnecessary complexity? And that's, a really big challenge, isn't it? So, this captures, I think, what I said in my preamble. The Energy Centre for Doctoral Training is part of Durham Energy Institute. We have a science as society approach. We sort of think about, the grand challenge of energy in the UK. We've got 200 academics across the faculties. There's a master's program and the CDT program. And, our industrial advisory board is very supportive of what we're doing, because they immediately see that this contextual support really adds value to the individual experience of the PhD candidates. So that's great. And, these, you can read this on our website, but, we want people to understand the full complexity of energy and its implementation in society. So the interdisciplinary ethos, thinking about the, the low carbon future. Well, I guess if we were writing this now, we'd talk about net zero. We talk about, technical and social responses, links between science and society. So this environment is the sort of environment that the candidates sort of inhabit. And, you've got some pictures, always nice to see pictures of smiling PhD students allowed out of the lab, isn't it? So field trips to visit offshore wind farms. And, this was in Wales, the Centre for Alternative Technology, and so on. So picking up on the criteria that I mentioned earlier, these are the kinds of things that we were looking for in our candidates. Was there evidence of this? And if so, how did that impact them, or what did that mean for their individual experience as doctoral candidates and doctoral researchers? And the other thing that we thought about is, if we're thinking about someone who has a long-standing tradition or is very rooted in a single discipline, is there a way of, I don't know, sort of analysing or quantifying or codifying their engagement with an interdisciplinary environment? So, after much discussion, I came up with this sort of 3-level framework, which, as I should say, as a physicist, this is not robust in any way, and it's not really validated by other research in the literature, but it just seemed to me, as someone who's worked in this area, to be reasonable. So level 1 is the perspectives. You come along and you take a look and you say, what's going on in here? You're an observer. Level 2, you begin to engage. You have a dialogue, you have an interaction. You begin to talk with people from other disciplines about finding common research interactions and research ideas. So that's a much more sort of engaging. And then the 3rd level, which we call methodologies or transformation, is where you really begin to synthesize something completely new. So I guess going back to the illustration, this would be the, sort of, the multi-fruit ice cream. And I have to say that's really difficult for doctoral candidates to get to that stage. So we were looking for evidence of engagement at these different levels. in our sort of investigation of our candidates. So we ran semi-structured interviews. This was a few years ago before anyone had heard of Zoom, so we used Skype. Margaret was in Australia for some of this, so we used Skype and phone and so on, face-to-face discussions, analysis, and then, you know, a presentation of our provisional findings to participants to sort of get them to validate, you know, what we had identified. So we interviewed 22 candidates, or 22 participants in total. 13 candidates, 7 supervisors, and 2 other people who had quite detailed working knowledge of it. 17 male, 5 female, and a spread across the sort of different disciplines, mainly engineers, because, you know, our centre is predominantly sort of engineers. So let's begin to look at our findings. So the first one, the benefits. You know, so these are sort of quotes from the candidates, takes you out of your blinkered PhD research. Once you see what other people do, you see how you can use some of their ideas to improve your own work. And then having it to explain your work gives good practice to have to present your research to a broad audience, even though it doesn't affect your research. The task of presenting what you do to a general audience in a way that is accessible helps refine and develop your own thinking and your own vocabulary. So, and then this shift from, you know, blue skies, you know, the grounding, you know, because it's energy, you know, it's very much grounded in sort of a number of very sort of practical questions. You know, why is this research important? And that's quite easy to answer when it comes to energy. So we identified, you know, many challenges for the candidates. Interdisciplinary research. It was tricky. It shouldn't be, but it feels like a completely different science. Having no right answer is very difficult. So that, you know, that's about the sort of language and growing into, you know, engaging with an interdisciplinary environment. When you discuss it outside the department with other people, it does sometimes raise eyebrows. Are you getting 2 half PhDs? Well, that, you know, is a very clear articulation of some of the issues identified in the literature. You know, what does a really high quality interdisciplinary PhD project look like? Amazing how much more you need to explain things outside your own discipline. Questions you don't get in your own discipline, you suddenly get these bizarre left of field questions from another discipline. So, you know, that's very much reinforcing the fact that, well, what I would say actually, I mean, just my own comment rather than, you know, the candidates' comments would be that I think interdisciplinary approaches reveal hidden complexity in these problems. You know, so the fact that you are looking at an engineering problem from a human geography or an anthropological or ethnographic perspective, you see things that other people don't see, and you can talk about it. And it's a bit like opening a curtain and giving people a glimpse into something. And I think that's what this candidate is touching on here. So that's quite important. Yeah, so these are some comments that the candidates had about, you know, effective supervisors for interdisciplinary work. You know, so, I mean, we all want supervisors who've got high standards and, you know, to keep in contact and have regular meetings. I can see if you had supervisors with different opinions, I can see that would be a problem. Correct. We want supervisors to trust that the candidate can make decisions on how disciplines come together. In the end, it's your PhD and your supervisors aren't going to get it for you. So I think that's beginning to connect with this idea in the literature about the candidates themselves having to navigate that complexity. And, you know, that's why we sort of emerged with this idea of emotional intelligence as a potential, you know, requirement for you know, success in this environment. So the sort of fourth and final candidate slide here, I think you've got to be a lot more open-minded to do interdisciplinary work. Be prepared to be involved. And, you know, from that, you know, we identified that some disciplines and topics work better together. Might social science candidates who have more flexibility than science candidates who have to follow certain research protocols. You know, so we were getting glimpses in our sort of interaction with the candidates, that, you know, some disciplinary perspectives were more sort of amenable to opening up or opening out to interdisciplinary working than others. So that's an interesting question that we might sort of touch on or discuss later. So let's move on and think about supervisors. So this is the first slide about the view of the supervisors. So this is what the supervisors I didn't interview them, Margaret interviewed them because I'm the director. So, you know, I didn't want to sort of bias them, but, you know, so this is what they said. The CDT, Centre for Doctoral Training Environment, provides enrichment for students, a much wider education than what they would otherwise have changed. Horizon widening rather than changing actual research. It's about giving the candidates permission to be a bit wacky. So I thought these were really nice ways of capturing this idea of breadth versus depth, and the fact that, you know, what an interdisciplinary environment does is it very much encourages candidates to come out of their sort of silos or bunkers and, you know, expands their field of view. You know, sometimes I liken doing a PhD or a doctorate to looking down a microscope, and as the PhD progresses, the magnification gets ever higher and the field of view gets smaller and smaller. You know, so eventually in your PhD research, you're working on, you know, something that's minuscule, and, you know, you're looking at that in great detail. But actually what we're doing is stepping back, reducing the magnification, but giving people, you know, a much wider field of view. You know, in many ways, the view from an airplane at 30,000 feet is completely different from the view you get, you know, at the ground as you're sort of, you know, looking at your problems. So that was very much something that the supervisors validated. So this is what they had to say, you know, about some of the challenges. We've got a very department-centric system, structures, costs, you know, that sort of quip I made about photocopying earlier. I mean, it's really important. You know, the PhD student is often ping-ponging across disciplines, and this can be quite bruising. System is geared towards silos. And, you know, some supervisors identify problem of finding journals. You know, where do you publish your interdisciplinary work? Research sponsors say they like interdisciplinary research, but also say this application doesn't belong here. I think that's beginning to move on a little bit more. I mean, if anything, you know, we've seen, well, huge changes in the sort of funding regime, research funding regime in recent years. You know, and of course, the research councils have merged into UKRI, UK Research and Innovation. And that has sort of opened up possibilities of working on sort of, you know, societal challenges that bring together sort of cognate, but nevertheless distinct disciplines. So, you know, that's a positive development, I think, that we have seen in recent years. Good interdisciplinary students have to love research as a concept rather than focusing on the topic. I thought this was a really thoughtful and insightful comment from one of the supervisors about, you know, candidates. You've got to sort of, you know, research has got to be your thing if you want to sort of move into interdisciplinary research. I would agree with that. I think that's a really interesting comment. So this is what supervisors said about themselves in terms of what they viewed as being good supervisors. And the first comment is great. Be prepared to look a bit of a moron. You know, I mean, academics like to think they're experts, and, you know, we might be experts in something that's the size of a postage stamp, but we certainly don't know everything. And, you know, sometimes it can be quite uncomfortable to go into an environment where you're not quite sure what's going on, and everyone thinks you know what's going on, you know, and that sometimes can be a bit like that. We tried to publish the work a couple of times and use this in the title, Be Prepared to Look a Bit of a Moron, because we thought that would make a really interesting title for a publication. Referees weren't having any of it, so we had to drop that, but never mind. Supervisors must have an open mind and set aside subconscious or conscious bias. So that sort of openness to new ideas is recognized as a required trait for effective interdisciplinary supervision. Be willing to have your own views challenged, explored, and pulled apart. So, you know, again, this sort of, you know, robust dialogue and discussion about, you know, what different perspectives have to say about different things. And, you know, I mean, I'm not a social scientist, but, you know, nevertheless, I have observed that, you know, there's a lot of contestation of ideas and concepts amongst different, you know, social science disciplines. So again, that can be part of, you know, the complexity that, you know, candidates and supervisors have to manage and navigate. Products of the system tend to be very focused on own specialization, whereas those who embrace interdisciplinary research are those who have a broader background. So some suggestion we heard that, you know, people who had previous experience in industry before entering academia, of which we had quite a number in the engineering department at Durham, you know, were more open because they had had that experience of broader and sort of richer environments before the Department of Engineering. So sort of connecting with our sort of framework, you know, about the sort of methodology, you know, minimal comment from interviewees. I struggle to see different methods and approaches in the social sciences, you know, so for some, this comment, I imagine, would have come from someone with a sort of science or engineering background. You know, so for some, you know, that's quite problematic for them to do. You know, level 2 dialogues. So here, you know, where you are coming in and you're sort of, you know, you're having a go, as it were, you're discussing. You know, we find major benefits reported by our interviews, helping participants understand and talk with one another, provide examples of things you can peg to their experience as a learning experience. You know, so lots of evidence of positive benefits from engaging with and discussing research with people from different disciplinary backgrounds, which is great. You know, we knew that was the case because of our experience of running the centre over a number of years. And then, you know, this sort of level of perspectives, you know, most reported changing perspectives, you know, this idea that, you know, they sort of, you know, they stand on the periphery and observe for quite some time, you know, most reported changing perspectives. The thing that really makes you think about your project in a different way has definitely been the site visits. You know, so going to see energy in action, it were. A real positive is that you can become aware of the way that different people approach thinking and research. Useful in the way that people from different disciplines have been able to inform my own work. So, you know, really strong evidence there of, you know, clear benefits emerging from the candidates' sort of engagement. So the candidate framework, you know, sort of transformer would be the candidate who changes his or her view of research, the world themselves, as a result of the interdisciplinary experience. Relatively rare, I think, if I'm being honest. The strategist who uses the interdisciplinary environment to support their requiring learning. More evidence and much more common. The conserver who finds it difficult to move from the comfort zone of their disciplinary foundation. And, you know, that may well be many, you know, doctoral candidates. You know, in the Department of Physics at Durham, we've got, I don't know, 120 PhD students. And, you know, many of them are not in the least bit interested in anything that is outside the topic of their research. And that's fine, you know, because we have an environment where, you know, we require and expect people to be specialist researchers. But, you know, I think there is benefit in people who are willing to have that sort of breadth, that widening perspective. So then when you think about the sort of the frame or the sort of, you know, the framework or the program, you know, how do we provide something that supports this development? You know, the two aspects are the skills, the communication skills, employability skills. I remember speaking to one PhD candidate in mathematics, you know, when they were leaving a sort of pseudo exit interview. And they came to thank me for, you know, the opportunity to be part of the program. And, you know, they said that their experience, quote, was pure CV fodder. And, you know, I thought that was great. You know, the idea that they recognized that that experience in our Energy Centre for Doctoral Training program had enriched them and provided something that merited, you know, a particular mention on their, you know, sort of PhD or on their CV capturing their PhD experience, I thought was great. Knowledge gained about various topics. Engineers learning about aspects of geology, geographers learning about, how wind turbines work. The engineers learning why societal actors matter, and learning that they need to engage with the complexities of the planning process if they want these beautiful turbines they design to actually be used. So there's lots of examples of where those benefits can really come about and happen. So that led us to think, well, if you wanted, this is a bit of a strange question, but if you wanted to create an interdisciplinary environment from scratch, where would you go, how would you do it, and what might it look like? So, our first hypothesis is that you need a strong focus. You need something that people can identify with. And I would endorse this even more strongly, as you'll see when I come to my next slide. But energy, this was set up 2009. So what's that, 11 years ago, 12 years ago. So energy has provided a really strong focus, because everyone, who's doing a PhD has a view about energy, even more so now than they did back when it started, so that gives a sort of framework and an identity. Candidates who are prepared to have a go and to be involved. A well-structured learning environment, including introductions to all sorts of different things, research approaches, methodologies, an overview of all sorts of different things. This is an interesting one. Durham is, well, we've grown a bit, but we're not a huge university. You can, we have a science site, which is a sort of pseudo campus, but effectively all our sort of main academic departments are within 10 minutes walk of each other. So, that sort of physical locale provides a really nice interactive opportunity. Although, of course, I'm sitting here thinking, well, Zoom does the equivalent nowadays. So maybe that's something we might need to revisit and sort of rethink. Small and cozy and physically appropriate, not having to walk long distances. So the fact that at the time, when this was written, there weren't sort of lots of barriers to interaction. So that's a sort of overview of what we found from our Energy Centre for Doctoral Training. One of the other things I do at Durham is I'm the director of our Global Challenges Centre for Doctoral Training. So this was set up in 2019, 2 years ago. This was funded by some GCRF Global Challenge Research Fund, money from the UK government, which very mistakenly, in my view, the government has cut the UK aid budget. So that has really reduced the amount of funding available for this. But effectively, we created a new Centre for Doctoral Training. It has a single cohort at the moment of 24 PhD candidates who are all from developing nations. They're all doing individual PhD projects, which are aligned with one or more of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So there are benefits for at least 17 primary beneficiary nations and benefits for, a number more, as you can see there. The PhD candidates are across 15 different academic departments involving 55 PhD. I'm not sure why there's a rogue apostrophe in supervisors, apologies for that. And it's challenge-based research, so it's multidisciplinary. We identified these projects by having a call within the university, and then we sort of ranked the projects and awarded funding to the best rated projects. So these projects had to be multidisciplinary in that they had to have supervisory teams from different academic disciplines, different departments. We also fund a placement in the partner nation. We pay all the fees and the stipend and the RTSG and all the things that a fully funded CD2 would ordinarily do. And the vision of this is to use research as a vehicle to develop solutions to particular challenges. And those challenges are not located within for vast majority are not located within a primary academic discipline. They are located at boundaries and interfaces. You know, so I am supervising one of the PhD projects looking at planning for preparing to deal with waste material from end-of-life photovoltaic panels in India. You know, so solar PV, solar photovoltaics has really taken off, which is great. But these panels will last 25, 30 years in the field, and then they stop working. And what do you do with that material at the end of life? It's not landfill, which it might ordinarily become. There's lots of valuable resources, minerals, metals, all sorts of things in there that might be recycled and repurposed. So I am thinking about designing some sort of approach that might transfer to India. But, you know, as I said earlier, this project is co-supervised with someone in the Department of Anthropology who is an expert on field work and ethnographic studies and the use of renewable energy by communities in Nepal and India. You know, so that brings an extra dimension to the project that really helps us move it forward. Anyway, there's a link there that you can sort of click on, and that will take you to the website and show you more about the centre. So just a few more slides before I conclude. You know, so maybe some questions that you might want to think or reflect on or might come up in the discussion. Can interdisciplinary work only work as an add-on because it's too difficult to build a career around interdisciplinary research? I have to say, I'm not sure I completely agree with that, but it's an interesting question or hypothesis, isn't it? You know, do you need to find discipline areas that are not too divergent for interdisciplinarity to work? You know, do we have the time? It takes a long time to get traction, a long time to understand the ideas and concepts. Is a 3.5, 4-year full-time or longer part-time PhD the best, you know, time or place to do it? Question. How can we help participants who just don't have the vocabulary? And, you know, for me, that's one of the, you know, the really interesting questions. You know, each discipline has its own language. What's the language of interdisciplinarity? You know, the language of the informed lay person, the language of the non-specialist that is sufficiently clear, compelling, and robust to be able to, you know, sort of identify, you know, all those different questions. You know, so I think that's, you know, that's a real challenge. You know, what does that language look like? And it has to be, I think, developed by experience, doesn't it? So, summary. An interdisciplinary environment is perceived by many as giving added value. It widens horizons, develops communication skills. Interdisciplinary research is seen as more challenging. Existing structures present barriers. It's difficult to get started. You don't necessarily have the knowledge or vocabulary. It's a new way of doing research, often without a home. You know, so that's some of the benefits and some of the challenges that we sort of identified. This slide has got references. I realize you don't have time to assimilate and read all of those in detail, but it's in the file that you've got the link for in the chat. And, you know, it's thank you for your attention. And I'm very happy to sort of answer any questions you might have or discussion or, yeah, over to you, really, I think.